Okay, so I'm going to do, I hope, a relatively short video going over my code. And what I want to say before I jump in and look at my code, because I'm going to go over it in a little bit of detail, because I know this first assignment can be a little intimidating. And the way I've set this up, maybe it didn't make sense, but that's why reaching out and asking questions is a great idea. And remember, there's two parts to this, and I'm not going to go over everything that was in here. That wouldn't make sense because I'm going to go over my code, but I want to say this. And when you reply here, you want to say, if you looked at somebody else's code, if you got inspired by it, and especially if you used it, which I'm going to show you how I did this, how I used somebody else as the example of how to determine if something is prime. Right? So I did do this on step 2, and here's my thing I'm going to tell you. It is very common in coding to use sample code. The thing is, you should never use somebody else's code unless you've spent the time to understand how that code works. Okay? And the code example I used took me a little bit to walk through it and figure out how it worked, because first I had to spend some time, as I suggested you did here, in figuring out, what is, and prime numbers are so important in so many different areas. Encryption, math, finance, believe me, it's used more than you can imagine. So having an understanding of prime numbers is good, and then how to determine them obviously takes another level, and then how to code them takes an additional level. So in your reply, right, talk about that process for you, right? And just be honest, because here's the deal. You can always find, if you keep looking hard enough, an example exactly, well, the chances are you'll find one that does what you want or what you're being asked to accomplish. But if you do that without giving yourself the time, especially like in here in step 1, to really think about that and to attempt to do that, because this is going to really show you how well the code along, how well you got that. Right? So don't cheat that process, because when we get to the development, which is 50% of this class, it's going to make it really much more challenging for you to take a concept that you come up with and write code for it. And if you do end up using, which I've said in step 2 is fine to do, just make sure, and I'm reiterating, that you take the time to understand their code. Okay? So I'll first walk you through my part of the code, and then I'll show you how I spent some time understanding the code example that I used. So I'll move over to VS Code here. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the prime IO, because basically it's the interval plus the prime. So in this case, I'm setting up a variable, and I'm setting it equal to a string, capital Y. And then I say while run is equal to capital Y string, right? Run this code, which now asks the user for some input. Now, again, you didn't have to do this part. I did this part because this is how I wanted my code to run. So I shouldn't see anybody else with this exact code, because I wrote this code specifically for how I wanted to do it. Now, 2 people could write code that is identical. It could happen, but the chances are probably pretty low, just because we all interpret things differently. So then I did some, output to the user. Again, what we're doing here is we're asking the user for some input, and then we're storing that input. Now, in this case, we're not actually doing a lot. I do a little bit of error checking, and I'll show you why, because that's part of what I wanted the assignment to do. Right? So remembering that when you use input, that's going to store whatever it gets into a string, and I needed an integer, so I converted it right there. I could have done another code step to do, or another line expression to do that. And then I asked for the ending number, do the same concept. And then I just do some simple logic. And again, as we learn more, like try catch block, which we'll learn later, we can use that to, because let's say the user gives us, and you should do this because it's going to throw a code. In this case, I'm not handling it. But again, It's because I'm trying to give you just an example. And as we learn more later, we'll find out better ways to actually, because you have to never trust what the user gives you. You'll hear this in coding all the time. Okay, so I'm still in this while loop. I've asked for the inputs. I've done some comparison, and I've said if the start is less than the end, because in that case, I'm asking for the beginning and the ending value that I'm going to iterate over to output only the prime numbers. And so what I did, I'm going to come back to this code because this is the code that I used. I gave a reference to it. I did some minor modifications. Okay, and then what I did, and again, that's this block right here. Okay, so what I could do for a second is I could just roll that up. Another VS Code nice thing. Any IDE will do that. But in here I said else, right? If this condition is false, right, I'm going to print out, or if this condition, sorry, so if the start is less than, right, so in this case, if the start is greater than, then I'm going to output, the number needs to be greater than the ending number. And then I'm going to say output to the user, do you want to run it again? Because at this point, right, we've run through the code. I'm going to do, again, get input. This time I don't have to convert it because all I'm looking for is, do you want to run it again? I've even given them a hint like yes for run it again, right? Or if they do anything else but that, right, I'm going to break out the code. And this is how I handle that here. So if run is not equal to capital Y, okay, because I'm checking their input, then I print, thanks for running my code, right? Because that's in this block. And then I just say continue, which is going to send me back up to this while, checking this while. Is the while equal to yes? So if it's not, they've entered something differently, then it drops out. Okay, so now I want to show you the process that I went through. So first I went and looked for some code, and this is what I was referring to before, you should really spend time. If you're not willing to spend the time to understand what this programmer has written, then don't use their code. It's not good for you, right? It won't help you. So I decided I liked this, and I got a general idea. I kind of got what they were doing here. So in this case, right, I'm handling the inputs. I'll do that in my code. But I see what they're doing is they're doing a loop here for value and range, and the start here and the end. Okay, so what I did is I just stored those in variables. And it says if value is greater than 1, because I know that 1 is not a prime number. So then what I'm doing inside of this for loop is I'm doing another loop. So now in this case, I have to start thinking about what are they doing here. So I decided to switch over and actually run this code as you've seen him do in the visualize, and I got it off Tutor. You can say visualize Python, you'll find this. So I started running through the code to understand what they were doing. And what I realized after a couple of times through was they had figured out an algorithm that would start with the range at 2, determine a value by, and I had to figure out what whack, in this case, val, 2 division signs 2. Or in this case, says, is that divide by 2? And I did a little research. I kind of knew what it was, but I decided and found it, and it's called the floor division. So it takes basically whatever is, and this is an example here, right? So it's going to take X, and here's actually the operator itself in use, and its inputs of 15 and 4. And so you can see if I just divide them, I get 375. But if I take the floor of them, I only get the integer, the 3 in this case. Now in this example. So I went back over to the code and I'm like, okay, so they're going to take the value. So we're starting at 11. We're going to divide or get the floor to 2. So in this case, if I divide 11 by 2, I get 5.5. The floor of that, drop the 0.5 is 5. Add 2, I get 7. So I know I'm going to range. I'm going to iterate over. I'm going to do a range of 2, starting at 2 and going to 7. And then I decided to print out 2 so I could print out N because I just wanted to see it as I was thinking about it. And then it said if the value, whatever I'm looking at, 11, and this is another, I think this is a new operator for this class. I don't think he's covered modulus yet, so I had to go out and I knew what modulus was, but if you don't, go figure it out. So it's whatever it is, the remainder part. When you when you do division, it's the remainder part. So in this case, the logic is asking if that remainder is 0, we know this is not a prime number, then break out, right? Break out of this for loop. Else, right, if it is, then we're actually going to, in this case, do a check, right? So we're going to do another, so this was an if statement. So if val modulus n is equal to 0, we're going to break out. Else, if it's not equal to 0, we're going to do a check here. And this is the lot. You can see by running this, it's showing you where I'm at in the code. It's going to say if n is equal to, then again, we almost do that. We could actually even modify this a little more here, but we're going to do that same floor calculation plus 1. And in that case, we're going to say, yeah, that's the prime number. So what they've done is figured out a way to write a pretty concise block of code to figure out if a value in this range is prime or not by checking, coming up with a range, testing the modulus, right? If it's equal to 0, if the remainder, break out of it. Else, we're going to do a test here that says if n, and this is the number in the range, floor 2, which we know is 5 plus 1 would be 6. And what that means is if we've gone through all of these numbers in the range, right? If this is equal to where, that number, then that's a prime number. Again, you're going to find a lot of different code examples out there for doing it. Just be willing to spend. Now, it's not, and this is what I'll end with when you're looking at stuff like this. And let's come back here. It's not that you have to, and this is kind of hard to say, but it's like you want to spend enough time to understand the logic of what they're doing, right? For you to write that, you would have to have a lot more experience, but you can at least spend the time to understand what it's doing. Okay? So this is where we learn. It's just to think that we're not going to use somebody else's code. It's not true. We can use it to be inspired and maybe write something different. But using these tools to help us run through the code is really helpful because it starts to help us understand, oh yeah, what does a break statement do? Right? And then in my code, I use to continue, what does that do? And if you're not sure, right, if you either want to go back into the Udemy course, great. If you want to just search for it, that's fine too, right? It's just a matter of figuring out what the shortest way for you, whatever that your style is, to figure out to the best of your ability what that code is doing. Now, the why of the code is what I was trying to say. Probably not very eloquently, but that was my point. Anyway, Kelly gave you a good example. I was actually just prepping mine when I saw his, and he obviously did that. So remember, in your reply, right, if you're using other people's code, obviously, if you're using it directly, right, you definitely need to give them credit. And then if you looked at somebody else's code to help you write your own, you need to say that. And I know this may be a little cumbersome at the beginning, but trust me, I believe that if you follow this process, you're going to learn. So have a good one. Talk to you later.